G.F.W. Hegel believed that history flowed in a certain direction. He did not believe in representative democracy or universal suffrage. The greatest human fulfillment, according to Hegel, came through the state, which he elevated to near godlike status. He writes, "The state is the divine idea as it exists on earth. We must therefore worship the state as the manifestation of the divine on earth. The state is the march of God through the world." It may come as little surprise that Karl Marx was the most influential of Hegel's followers. One idea of Hegel that Marx and his followers built on was the master-slave dialectic. This is a belief that the master only understands his own world, but the slave understands both his own world and that of the master. This belief went on to inspire standpoint epistemology, a core concept in critical social justice. Karl Marx didn't seem to care much about communism. That sentence may strike you as odd, given that Marx's name is practically synonymous with communism. In his entire body of work, however, Marx barely mentions communism at all. The one thing he devoted thousands of pages to was criticizing capitalism. Marx's intellectual descendants followed in his footsteps here. From the publishing of the Communist Manifesto to contemporary critical theorists, these people know how to throw stones without mentioning what it is that they're defending. They know how to tear down and destroy, but have no clue how to build anything. Peter Singer writes, Marx's influence can be compared to that of major religious figures like Jesus or Muhammad. And in much of the world, his words are considered the ultimate source of truth and authority. The lives of hundreds of millions of people were transformed, for better or worse, by Marx's legacy. From this perspective, Marx is the chief prophet in a new religion of wokeness.
I feel like it just could be worth clarifying for people because, like, when we talk about communism and like what communism is, for me, the easiest way to understand communism is that it's like a spiritual eugenics program. They truly believe that they are going to transform man and create something new, and they think that they're going to do that through like changing external contexts and things like that. So like things like social credit aren't just for surveillance. Like they actually think that by having these incentive structures and kind of like, you know, like changing the way that people think through like brainwashing and things like that, that they are functionally changing reality. And at the end of that is a new man. And so in order to get to that new man, a lot of people are not going to be like able to go on the way. Like anybody that's in the way is going to have to be culled. I mean, it's like a hard kind of part of what this is.
The Communist Manifesto was published in 1848. Marx and Engels began this book by telling us that all of history is predicated on class struggle. They divided up the entire world into oppressor and oppressed, who were in constant opposition to one another.
The woke left, all the way back at least to Karl Marx, but probably even back to Rousseau before him, but certainly Karl Marx is like the consecrator of this concept of woke left, which I would describe, if we were going to be technical about it, as a socio-gnostic leftism. But we're not going to get into all that, I don't think. Maybe we will. But what this woke left was all about was that we're going to figure out what factor in society produces people. How do people become who they are, right? And Marx believed it was material conditions. A lot of people in this very modern era, industrial revolution period of time, thought material conditions, working conditions, living conditions, etc., made you who you were. And so the idea was that you're going to say, well, there's obviously two classes. That's an internationalist affair. And there's an underclass that's being cheated everywhere by an overclass that's cheating people everywhere. And what we're going to do is we're going to seize the means of production of society, thus people, so that we can seize the means of production of this oppression dynamic and reverse it such that we end it. That's the leftist myth. That's communism in its full abstract form. It could be economics, later it could be race or sex or sexuality or whatever else. This is my general thesis of how all of the woke theories like critical race theory and radical feminism and so on all come into being.
They make the case that there's been no progress since feudal times and that modern capitalism is no less oppressive than previous systems. The capitalist world, they say, is nothing but naked, shameless, direct, brutal exploitation. Marx and Engels were writing to an English working class, some of whom spent 14 hours a day, 7 days a week, working in factories and coal mines. It'd be hard not to concede that they had a point about rough working conditions. Today, critical theorists use the same language of brutal exploitation to describe someone with a substantially higher standard of living who works 20 hours a week as a barista. The manifesto concludes, "Let the ruling classes tremble at the communist revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. "Working men of all countries, unite." This slogan has traditionally been represented by socialists as a closed fist, and we see that image in banners for Black Lives Matter, often containing the same slogan as well. Marx consistently called for violent revolution to overthrow capitalism, believing that capitalism created inhuman existence. He believed this demanded the violent overthrow of the bourgeoisie. This mindset continued through the post-colonialism of Frantz Fanon and into the support for Hamas terrorism of the current social justice activists. Declaring yourself oppressed gives you limitless permission to behave violently. At one point, Marx personified communism by saying that it knows itself to be the solution, as though it were a god redeeming all mankind. Peter Singer says that Marxism is manifestly not a scientific enterprise, despite the fact that Marx and his followers consistently refer to these ideas as scientific. Its theories are not derived from detailed observation or factual studies, nor subjected to controlled tests or observations. Marx predicted that the rich would get richer and the poor would get poorer. He believed independent producers, or the petty bourgeoisie, would be driven out of business by large manufacturers. He believed that the rate of capitalist profit would continue to fall until capitalism collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. He believed that the most advanced industrial societies will be the first to embrace socialism and communism as the next phase of evolution. Literally every single one of these predictions was not just wrong, but the complete opposite of what he foresaw. Peter Singer says, "Most of them are so plainly mistaken that one can only wonder why anyone sympathetic to Marx would attempt to argue that his greatness lies in the scientific aspects of his work. Many socialist failures can be traced back to Marx's inability to understand human nature."
I think that a lot of Marxists, and Marx, man, you look into the guy, he was the original fedora-wearing, poor hygiene Reddit loser.
Neckbeard.
Neck beard, boils all over his body, probably autistic, horrible at being a man and a family man, and just constantly just writing these screeds about how unhappy he was. And even his dad was like, "Hey, dude, you're a loser, man. Like, what are you doing?"
His dad trashed him.
Just wrecked him, man. And so I think when you've got a fundamental unhappiness, you're looking for answers. And the problem with looking for answers is you might find yourself dedicated to the wrong one.
The great prophet of communism died on March 14, 1883. Marx's tombstone contains the engraved message from Feuerbach's 11th thesis. The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. This quote will take on more meaning as Marxism evolves into critical theory. As the theories of the first generation of Marxism ushered in the reality of the second generation, rosy speculation turned into a horrific nightmare. When I was a socialist, what I fundamentally wanted was a society that looked like John Lennon's song Imagine. What I didn't put together at the time is that many societies had, metaphorically speaking, collectively joined hand in hand to sing Imagine. The problem is, John Lennon turns into Vladimir Lenin remarkably quickly.
When I was a socialist, I thought that Americans had an unfair bias against socialism, and you're someone who came out of your family, kind of fled that system. And so you have seen a different side of it, kind of than the rosy, just we all care about each other kind of socialism that I think is kind of popular in like American consciousness.
Yeah, I mean, that's the propaganda. That's been the propaganda ever since, and it's promoted to the peasantry by the upper classes, and of course, as anyone who's lived under that regime knows, the purpose is to acquire all the wealth, put it into the hands of the people at the top in the ruling governmental party, and they are the ones who have the summer homes and the nice lifestyles and eat the caviar and drink the vodka while the peasants live in huts. So, I grew up with stories about what it was like for my parents to, live under communism. And so that sort of was formative for me. And I heard about people escaping, after the war and, the hardships they faced, the hunger, the repression, the discrimination in medical care. And so I got a different side than most, say the average American student who lives up grows up comfortably in the suburbs and is sent to college. And here he has a professor saying, well, there are all these injustices under the American system, but here is an alternative, and we would have no prisons and no poverty. And, this kind of, they present this kind of idyllic scenario, which, adolescents are especially, vulnerable to. You're a teenager and you want, oh man, here are these homeless people, here are these hungry people, war is going on here and there, and what's wrong with our system? And the professors, feed into that and use those students to recruit to their cause.
Alexander Solzhenitsyn's The Gulag Archipelago was the first to detail in great length the crimes of the Soviets under Stalin. It wasn't just brutality and dehumanization that led to suffering. Many of the deaths came from mismanagement due to attempts to micromanage the economy through collectivization. When people work as individuals for themselves and their families, they're incentivized to be as productive as possible. When that incentive is removed and all are swept into the collective, the free rider problem runs rampant.
Yeah, well, that's just like your opinion, man.
Social loafing is the tendency for people to exert less effort when they pool their efforts toward a common goal than when they're individually accountable. According to social psychologists David Myers and Jean Twenge, studies show that workers are more productive when evaluated individually than as a team.
What would you say you do here?
Communes can be a paradise for parasites due to the free rider problem. In the Soviet Union, peasant farmers would work most of their time on the collective farms, but they had a small plot of land for themselves personally. Even though these personal plots accounted for only 1% of the agricultural land, they supplied 27% of the agricultural output. Similar outcomes occurred in communist Hungary and China.
It's so interesting how you flip this discourse on its head, because what you're saying is socialism is like this very elitist ideology where, and kind of what I kind of came into a lot of my political leftism, starting with like Occupy Wall Street. It's like capitalism is the 1% oppressing the 99%, and we need socialism to kind of stick up for the common man, right? But you're saying that's the opposite of the reality.
Right. And when you think about, what's evolved from Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, tearing down businesses, destroying the symbols of our history, tearing down statues of everything. All this destruction, and who's funding it? The big corporations. So the big corporations have a stake in this. It's a, part of communism is making alliances with the big companies, having only two classes of people, the super wealthy and the peasantry that's dependent on the handouts from the government. The goal among communists and these, what I would call plutocrats, which you were, thinking you were protesting against, is to eliminate the middle class. And that's, my first book, Howard Zinn, I noticed, that was his strategy, was to go after the middle class. They were in collusion, he said, with the capitalists who had all the power, and they were sort of bought out. They were promised a little bit in order to prevent the working classes from organizing. So he, according to his theory, is if you can put over this myth that you as an individual have the freedom to go out and start your own business or work at a job and advance by your own hard work and your initiative, that you will get ahead. He said, that's the myth that has been promulgated, but it's just a myth. It's, the middle classes, so-called, not wealth, but prosperity, relative prosperity. Prosperity is built on the backs of the workers, the enslaved, the Native Americans, and so forth.
The Cultural Revolution in Mao's China was famous for its denunciation rallies, or struggle sessions. It involved public humiliation of anyone deemed to be the enemy of the people. Such spectacles occurred in the workplace or in classrooms, at school. Exposing a teacher or parent as a counter-revolutionary was encouraged for young people. The purpose of this was thought reform or brainwashing. Many struggle sessions happened in the public squares in front of large gatherings of people, where the crowd would gather around a kneeling victim and shout harassment. Peasants were told to speak bitterness by accusing landowners of thought crimes in order to seize their property. Violence against landowners and anyone deemed reactionary was not uncommon.
The field of psychology is pretty well cooked, in my opinion. It's adopted like all of this approach, and what it's actually doing, and this is kind of typical of what you would see in Soviet Union, and it was, I think, probably the most characteristic feature of Mao Zedong's reign in the CCP, but that might be overstating the situation a little bit, but a lot of people claim that Mao's tyranny in the 1960s and 50s, actually 50s and early 1960s in China, was the world's first psychological totalitarian environment. So yes, they murdered a lot of people, but it wasn't like the Soviets. It was not like what Stalin did, right? So Stalin just lined people up and shot them. It was really brutal. Mao did famously say power flows from the barrel of a gun, but he ran mostly a psychological operation on his own people. It was all about what he called ideological remolding, which has been rendered into English usually as thought reform. And it was effectively using trauma bonding and kind of psychologically traumatic activity like struggle sessions, social psychology activity, in order to get people to be ideologically committed to this new way of thinking.
Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution lasted from 1966 until his death in 1976. By all accounts, the Cultural Revolution was both an economic and moral failure. It plunged people into poverty and resulted in the deaths of over 30 million people, mostly due to starvation. This was after the deaths of over 30 million people caused by the Great Leap Forward. Plans for increased steel production and crop yields backfired, and the collectivization of farms led to mass shortages. The Nazis predominantly killed people out of hatred, while the Communists predominantly killed people out of stupidity and mismanagement, though they also killed numerous people out of hatred. Anyone who opposed Mao's policies was accused of being right-wing and subsequently disappeared.
You know, I mean, most people credit as like the grandmaster of this as being Mao Zedong with the Red Guard, right? So the history there, the short version of the history is Mao takes power in 1949. He runs a ridiculous communist regime up until 1960, at which point they're ass deep in his latest cockamamie campaign that was called the Great Leap Forward. Preceding that, you had the 100 Flowers campaign. Preceding that, you had the Socialist High Tide. You have all this like really over-the-top attempts to force communism, and it's all bad, right? But everybody's silenced as a result of the 100 Flowers campaign and the following anti-rightist campaign that was the biggest purge that Mao ever did by 59. So then 59 going into 60, going into 61, they had a really bad winter. One of those two winters was really bad. And so you end up with what's called the Great Famine. Like, it's argued how many people died, but the conservative estimate is 55 million people died. The more realistic estimate is somewhere, north of 70 million, 80 million, and then the generous estimate is maybe 100 million or more people died in this single, basically, year. And it wasn't murders. It was mostly starvation. Some of it was exposure to cold. A lot of it was suicides. Surprisingly, very little of it was disease. Actually, it's horrifying to read the history of the Great Famine. The reason people didn't die of disease is because they didn't live long enough to get sick because they were too busy starving and freezing to death. Yeah, just let that one sink in. Okay, so Mao loses power over this. He's still technically in charge, but like he's not running the show anymore. So he gets replaced by Liu Shaoqi in terms of actually operate. So Mao's chairman, but he's no longer the premier of the CCP. And so Liu Shaoqi starts running the show from 62 to 67, and Mao actually working with his friends that are and loyal friends that are still in the army starts propagandizing the youth to do a youth rebellion, which he launches in August of 1966, which is called the Red August. The kids go out some of them literally children, some of them middle school, some of them high school, some of them young college students, and some just outside of college, just after college, go out, they murder, I don't know, a couple thousand people in Beijing. They're destroying property like pretty much unchecked. They're given the right to do whatever they want. If the police go to intervene, the directive from the Cultural Revolution group is that they're not to be touched. And Mao is pushing this with the message to rebel is justified. And the claim was that the Communist Party had become itself corrupted by capitalists and needed to be purged. And so these young people become the model. So everybody credits Mao with having created like the generational rebellion. The motto was smash the four olds. So you think of all the old elements of society, those are the secret poisons that have to be purged to make the communist society pure enough. And the logic was that the younger generation at that point, so we're talking, 66, he took power in 49. So we're talking, up to the age of 17, these are kids who grew up entirely under communism. They have no memory whatsoever of the before times. And so Mao's idea was that since they have no memory of the before times, they have no value in the old values, the old ways of thinking, the old ways of doing things, the old customs. So they'll be willing to destroy them. So there's we credit this to Mao because he understood something, but all of the tyrants of history understood this. The Hitler Youth was built for the same reason. The BDM, which was the young women's division of the Hitler Youth, did this. It doesn't matter whether we're looking in Hungary with the green shirts, or we're looking in Italy with the black shirts. We could go across the list. We could look at the little Octoberists in Soviet Union. You have this idea of creating the youth movement because they don't understand or value the old ways, right?
It feels to me like the Marxist project ideology generally is kind of an infantile type of thinking. Like, I want perfection. I want it right now. I don't want to have to go through anything to get perfection. I demand it. I'm going to have a temper tantrum if you don't give it to me.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, this is why Milan Kundera associated youth and the archetype of youth with the spirit of revolution and specifically communism. And he wrote extensively about that. It's really for better or worse, a sort of a youthful spirit that wants to establish its own utopia and thinks it knows how that's going to happen and hasn't learned from history.
Yeah. Well, I think the reason a lot of them haven't learned from history is because history's not studied, and history often they attempt to erase it. And I'm thinking of Chairman Mao in the Cultural Revolution, the desire to get rid of everything old. The revolution must only be new. Everything old must go. And part of this, like this eternal youth drive, seems to be, let's just forget all of our past and pretend like our society is old.
Yeah. You're seeing the same archetypal pattern that I was getting at in the book. I mean, that's described as the Senex, the old man, also Father Time, associated with history, tradition, all of that. That's exactly what the eternal youth is in conflict with. So from a Jungian point of view, you kind of want to get those two archetypal dynamics sort of speaking to one another. But yeah, that's a perfect example. You got to overthrow the olds,
The Red Guard consisted of student revolutionaries who took to the streets to purge reactionaries and defend Mao's revolution. They would shout and bang drums to drown out the voices of any dissenters. Both students and government officials developed the paranoia of bourgeois infiltration into their systems. Drawing on the teachings of Mao, students of the Red Guard demanded that China destroy the old ways of doing things, the old customs, the old culture, the old habits, the old ideas. Streets and places were given new names to replace the old ways. Historical sites, including the Temple of Confucius and other religious places of worship, were destroyed. Tibetan Buddhists were forced to destroy their own monasteries. Many books, even entire libraries, were burned. During the cleansing of the class ranks, Mao sent those deemed insufficiently dedicated to the revolution to re-education camps. Between the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, Chairman Mao was responsible for the deaths of more than 60 million people. He was the greatest mass murderer in history, responsible for more deaths than every fascist regime in history combined, including the Nazis. The American radical left is nowhere near as violent as Mao, so I don't want to draw a false equivalency. However, the mindset of thought reform, struggle sessions, and purging those deemed insufficiently revolutionary are areas that deserve our attention.
if you don't have individuation of states from a federal government, then you don't have autonomy. And then you also don't have productivity, because productivity requires autonomy. And so this is why communist experiments always collapse. The energy doesn't work. It will never work, because you cannot destroy autonomy and have productivity at the same time. It's impossible. That's why America is the most successful country in terms of producing, just total output across the board, because out of all of the experiments in government that have been conducted, it provides the most autonomy and therefore the most productivity. We can't do what the woke want us to do and have anything resembling that.
A key premise here is to examine the shift in the socialist movement that occurred as a response to the monumental failure of socialist projects in the real world. Beginning in the 1950s and 1960s, socialist messaging began to switch from a focus on poverty to a focus on inequality. Critical theory and postmodernism represent what I call third-generation Marxism. Others have called this the cultural turn in Marxism, because this is where economics took a back seat and cultural issues were elevated to the forefront. A key aspect of postmodernism is moral and epistemological relativism. This is where we get the idea that there's no such thing as absolute truth, that you have your truth and I have my truth. From the West, we cannot pass judgment on even the most barbaric practices of other countries, such as female genital mutilation, because we cannot possibly understand their culture. We have long known that comfortable lies are preferable to uncomfortable truths.
I did not have sexual relations with that woman.
But now we have this ideology encoded into our universities, corporations, media, culture. Voltaire gave us an ominous warning. Those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. Postmodernism is essentially the opposite of Freudian psychoanalysis. All that has been brought up into the conscious mind must be surrendered to the bubbling cauldron of instinctual desires. The rational analysis must be surrendered to emotion.
The pre-modern world was generally dictated by religion. And so in like Freudian terms, you had the id with our baser instincts being negotiated by the superego, the patriarchs of the society, basically. Yeah. And then we come into modernity and we have like Enlightenment rationalism. And in a lot of ways, Enlightenment rationalism ignores the id and the superego in favor of the egos. It's like pure rationality, like this logic of efficiency. Yeah. God is dead. We're kind of ignoring that, but also we're going to try to suppress our baser instincts, just live in the ego. And postmodernism, to me, seems to ignore the superego. There's no God, there's no hierarchy, but it also ignores the ego, because there's no rationality that we recognize, and it's this pure, cauldron of instinctual desires. It's just pure id in a lot of ways. I'm wondering if you see that.
I can see that reading. It makes sense to me. It's strange. I think a lot of postmodernism, it kind of feels like it's the ego and consciousness kind of reaching an apex of like almost a hubristic certainty before it completely fails. I mean, the image that I use for a lot of postmodernism in my first book is the image of Prometheus. Prometheus, he steals fire from the gods. Now, symbolically, that means something like us humans are not going to be subjected to any will other than our own. The gods, they don't have authority over us anymore. We're going to become godlike. That's what is at the heart of the Promethean myth, is like we're going to assume a certain godlikeness and we're going to raise ourselves above the level of mere beasts. Prometheus brings fire, which brings culture, which brings knowledge, which brings the empowerment of human beings, right? And so it has this, it's sort of in many ways it's kind of an anti-religious myth in a way, stealing fire from the gods to empower human beings. And that's what Prometheus does, but he also has to suffer his own defeat at the hands of Zeus. I mean, he gets punished. He gets tied to a mountain, and an eagle comes and eats his liver out every day. The liver for the Greeks was like the seat of the soul. So there's a lot of symbolism there. So he has to suffer this huge torment for a long time. I kind of think of postmodernism as a bit like that. I mean, there's this attempt to sort of understand all narratives and understand that they're all completely corrupt or spent or we're somehow beyond them. And that is simultaneously, I think, the sort of the ego saying, I'm in control now. And at the same time, it's a type of thinking that undermines itself. It reminds me of what Jung would call an enantiodromia. It's when something turns into its opposite. So, for example, the sun rises, and right at its very peak at noon, roughly, it starts to descend. I kind of feel like the postmodern, especially perhaps the first generation postmodernists, they're right at that apex where they think we've got something now, and then it all starts to fall apart. Deconstruction falls apart by virtue of its own internal contradictions. The deconstructors start to deconstruct themselves.
Yeah.
Right?
Standpoint epistemology was fleshed out by Hungarian Marxist George Lukács in his 1923 book History and Class Consciousness. He believed that the working class had a better understanding of objective reality than the upper class. Sandra Harding utilized standpoint epistemology in her 1986 book The Science Question in Feminism, believing that women had a better understanding of the world than men. These ideas trace back to Hegel's master-slave dialectic, that an oppressed person has a more accurate view of the world than a more privileged person. Theodor Adorno began working with Max Horkheimer in America in 1938. Critics point out the glaring lack of empirical data in Adorno's research, which is often little more than his opinion. Rather than propose any concrete solutions, he believed that finding problems was more valuable than solving them. He believed inequality was hidden in the law, an idea carried forward by critical race theorists. This mindset is used to justify equity, or equality of outcomes, rather than equality of opportunity. A big principle of critical theory is that it's impossible for people to actually want to live under capitalism. So they use a variety of pseudoscience, psychoanalysis, and philosophical jargon to prove that people have been brainwashed into loving a system that oppresses them. Adorno sees the pursuit of happiness as incompatible with reason. He genuinely believes that the world would be happy if only we abandoned rationality. Adorno openly admits, I have exaggerated the gloomy side of things, with the belief that only exaggeration can be a medium of truth. This poetic truth, found in exaggeration, is a hallmark of contemporary social justice. Adorno smugly looks down on working-class people who adopt traditional attitudes, whose opposition to the most simple interests of their self-preservation is completely obvious. This idea that the only reason the commoners don't think like you is because they lack your wisdom is a common theme in social justice activism. In their book Dialectics of Enlightenment, Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno warn of what they call the destruction that would come from modern civilization's fear of departing from the facts. From the beginning of critical theory, it's clear that their real beef is with reality itself. I hope we can all hang on to a bit of fear of departing from the facts. They argue that the powerlessness of the masses increases with the quantity of goods allocated to them, arguing that this materially considerable rise in the standard of living actually hurts the working class. This is the initial Marxist turn away from the untenable idea that capitalism impoverishes people, toward the idea that the real problem with capitalism is that it makes us too rich. Adorno and Horkheimer bemoan the Enlightenment and the stigma attached to irrationality. I must admit that I too stigmatize irrationality. In fact, my preference for rationality is the main reason I reject critical theory. These guys are like doomsday prophets predicting that thinking clearly will end the world. Whether complaining about art or jazz music, Horkheimer and Adorno come across as two crabby old men complaining that the modern culture isn't as good as it used to be back in the good old days. Of course, they also blame the ignorant masses for lacking good taste. Adorno and Horkheimer believe that the masses are too stupid to understand how oppressed they are, and that they need enlightened individuals like themselves to force them to see the truth. There's no aspect of the modern capitalist system, no matter how much it benefits people's lives, that Horkheimer and Adorno are not willing to complain about. This book is a never-ending wailing and gnashing of teeth over the most mundane inconveniences or annoyances of modern life, peppered with phrases like, only meaninglessness is acceptable. Based on reading this book alone, I believe that it's highly likely that both Horkheimer and Adorno suffer from clinical depression. Their basic mentality is that everything's terrible, and if you disagree that it's terrible, it means you're too dumb to understand that it's terrible.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking, for example, of the goals of dialectical political warfare. So using permanent critique as like a almost like a wildfire agent to destroy things. I'm also thinking, for example, of delegitimizing existing authority. So going back and forth and undermining existing authority and things like that, capturing elites, disintegrating morals, making it so that people don't know what is or isn't true, and ultimately transforming society.
They direct us to scorn logic if it is against humanity. Of course, they define anything outside of Marxism as against humanity, by definition. They tell us that it is mistaken to believe that the truth of a theory is the same as its fruitfulness. In other words, economic theories should not be judged based on whether or not they provide prosperity or starvation. They should be judged based on their theoretical lens, dialectics, and historical context, which are all buzzwords used to describe Marxism. Critical theorists believe that a sign of how grim our society is can be reflected in looking at how happy people are. They believe that if people were sane and not brainwashed by the system, they would all be miserable and crying for revolution. Adorno bemoaned living in a world that deserves to die. He rejected the notion of looking for ways to fix society, instead of criticizing it, which he called actionism. Later critical theorists would call this solutionism. Herbert Marcuse studied under the Nazi philosopher Martin Heidegger in Germany, before moving to America to establish critical theory at the University of California, Berkeley. Marcuse fleshes out his conception of negative thinking, or attempting to dismantle the current ways of thinking. Like other critical theorists, Marcuse defines critical thinking and creative thought as anything Marxist, and stale thinking of the status quo as anything non-Marxist. Likewise, a one-dimensional society is capitalist, while a multidimensional society is Marxist. When you deal in poor ideas, it becomes necessary to slant the debate ahead of time by using narrowly defined terms and definitions. Marcuse believed that modern people did not understand what they really wanted because capitalism dominated their minds and forced them into modes of thinking that were controlled by industry. This is how Marcuse justifies the fact that the working class no longer had any real desire for socialism that he was pushing. He believed that the labor under capitalism was a form of slavery, even if people appeared relatively happy in their lives. He saw a growing economy as a parasite that stifled human flourishing. All of his ideas for alternatives, such as the liberated society, were vague. He believed that the solution to the domination and oppression of capitalism was the Great Refusal, in which everyone simply refused to partake in the system. Both his ideas for how to change and what to change seem poorly thought out. Marcuse is asking us to take a great leap of faith when he admits that the facts are not on his side when it comes to forming the new utopian society. He pushes on. In the face of apparently contradictory facts, critical analysis continues to insist the need for qualitative change is as pressing as ever. He tells us that capitalism involves the preservation of misery in the face of unprecedented wealth. Shortly after, he tells us that capitalism has raised the standard of living of the working class. He says that the populace opposing him does not phase his resolve. The fact that the majority of the population accepts, and is made to accept, this society does not render it less irrational, less redeemable. Here Marcuse goes full conspiracy theorist. He believes that he is one of the only people in society who understands what is really going on, while the rest of society is too dumb to notice their own oppression. And their happiness is proof of that. This theme keeps repeating. Marcuse says that because American capitalism has succeeded so much in delivering the goods to its people, critical theory is left without a rationale for transcending this society. I like to joke that Herbert Marcuse sells capitalism better than Milton Friedman ever could. Here we have a devout Marxist who's so angry that the working class can now afford their own home, their own car, their own color television, and now no one wants to be a socialist or have a revolution anymore.
When I think of America, we're living in abundance and prosperity. We have freedom. We have a democratic system of government. Like compared to the socialist societies, we're already living in utopia. And so if you hate that and you want to overthrow it, I'm thinking there's a line from Karl Marx where he called the ruthless criticism of all that exists, right? And then the critical theorists just hated that things were going so well in America. Like Marcuse was so frustrated that people didn't want a revolution because they didn't need one, right? And Marcuse's his solution was what he called the power of negative thinking. Can we get people to be pessimistic and criticizing things and calling it problematic? Right? Like, how can you stir up discontent, even though discontent really doesn't need to be here?
Yeah, and I saw that when I was in graduate school in the 1990s, and what we were reading in terms of theory and the way most of my professors presented literature was very critically. Oh, you think T.S. Eliot's a great poet? Well, just look at this evidence of anti-Semitism, racism, sexism, blah. And it was constantly. And it has filtered down to the high school level and the elementary school level. So, and then into the workplace.
Marcuse appears troubled by America's progress when he states that it is increasingly capable of satisfying the needs of the individuals through the way in which it is organized. At every turn, Marcuse tells us that his biggest challenge is convincing people to abandon a system that has made their lives more prosperous. His complaint about American capitalism, which we see repeatedly, is that it makes people's lives comfortable, enjoyable, fun, and it meets their needs. This is a problem because it hurts his recruitment for a Marxist revolution. Reading Marcuse was one of the straws that broke the camel's back for me when I was a socialist. I picked up a copy of One-Dimensional Man, hoping to find some irrefutable arguments for socialism and against capitalism, but Marcuse can't stop making socialism look terrible and capitalism look awesome. Herbert Marcuse is often called the father of the New Left. Marcuse stated in his essay on liberation that he did not believe anyone who disagreed with him on any political policy deserved democratic rights or freedom of speech. He believed that true liberating tolerance would mean intolerance against movements from the right and toleration of movements from the left. All conservative speech must be banned. The contemporary social justice idea of shutting down any speech that disagrees with him is rooted in this essay by Marcuse, who can be viewed as the father of cancel culture. After the fall of the New Left, Marcuse said that the movement would resurrect in universities. He was right.
I've been writing about this kind of stuff for a couple of years now, and put myself in the James Lindsay, Chris Rufo school of thought that you're kind of debunking in a sense. And so it was a little uncomfortable reading your book. In my book, the forces of good are Enlightenment rationalism and liberal democracy, and the forces of evil are critical theory and postmodernism. And you're kind of coming at it from a very different angle, and it was a discomforting thing trying to square what's going on, because you're making a very convincing case, and I want to see if what I'm laying out makes any sense to you. Like, I think the core of this ideology is cultural Marxism. I think at one point you said take out the cartridge of class and put in race. Instead of bourgeoisie and proletariat, you go black and white. So I think they were trying to do that for a long time. If you read like the old critical theorists, they were throwing everything against the wall to see if it stuck. I think Adorno at one point was criticizing jazz music, and just no one cared. It's like the meme of old man yells at cloud. Like no one cared about any of the stuff they were saying. And then at one point, like around the Marcuse generation, they discovered that if you say racist, the music stops, everyone freezes, and you can push that button as much as you want. So does that make any sense?
It does. I'd love to know I'd love to see the source of this and when that word racist, because my interpretation of critical theory is there was a real split in the sense that Marcuse really is the connecting thread. And I think Rufo's right in this, that, intellectually, Marcuse is the connecting thread from the interwar or the, European critical theory to the modern capital C critical theory. But if you look at the other critical theorists, Adorno and Habermas and these other people, you clearly Adorno was very critical of what he called left-wing fascism. When people would sort of get up on stage and prevent him from speaking. I think I'm not sure, other than Marcuse, if we can draw any links. And so I think in a way this is not actually, because the earlier cultural Marxism was all about, the masses are being dulled by pop culture and movies and all that, and that's why they're accepting capitalism. This is kind of I'm just not sure that if we take that and then we look at Marcuse, who was really into the New Left, I think Marcuse is somewhat of a sort of singularity, and I'm not as convinced that there's this connection back to the earlier critical theory or even Gramsci.
Liberation theology does have, just to touch on some of the points you raised, liberation theology does have strong KGB roots. There are, in fact, reasons to believe that it was a KGB creation outright. So the idea was that the Catholics had been putting up quite a decent fight against the Marxists. They were not actually going Marxist. They had their own problems. They had actually become quite integralist at the time, especially in South America. The integralismo movement in Brazil actually got a little bit out of control. It was really kind of a problem. It ended up getting stamped down by a left-wing dictator who got a right-wing dictator who got in power in the 60s. And all of a sudden, almost all these guys that were integralists, that were of prominence, suddenly became communists. It was really kind of funny. So at any rate, the KGB probably created liberation theology because they couldn't defeat the Catholics from without, so they're going to defeat the Catholics from within. I think there's a parallel here to the woke right, where they couldn't defeat MAGA from without, so now they're going to defeat MAGA from within through subversion of the movement itself from within, and that's what liberation theology represents.
One of the arguments I make in the book is that, to a large extent, woke is, which I define as making sacred of historically marginalized race, gender, and sexual identity groups. That's woke in a sentence. So it's really this fetishization and focusing of the holy trinity, race, gender, sexuality, on the left. And I argue that is not so much. I'm not saying there's nothing to the Chris Rufo, James Lindsay argument around Marxism, pulling out the class cartridge from the oppressor-oppressed console and sticking the identity one in. That's certainly part of what's going on. But what I argue is more important is what this is a kind of radicalizing of the underlying tissue of public morality in Western countries, which is basically left liberal, believes in equality, it believes in minority rights. And if you radicalize that underlying left liberal tissue, humanitarian, liberal, egalitarian, what you get is speech codes, what you get is affirmative action, what you get is disparate impact law, this whole panoply of policies. None of these things, microaggressions, emotional trauma, all the therapeutic stuff, this is not something that you can connect with Marxism or even with Gramscian or cultural Marxism. It is actually a separate inheritance which is much more linked to this. If you take this phrase, be kind, be nice, which woke people tend to trot out all the time, again, that's very foreign to the Marxist tradition, which was really quite opposed, very opposed. Marx was very opposed to humanitarian socialists, utopian socialists, or even social democrats who were pushing this idea of reforming the work week, not having child labor, not having a very long work week. All of those reformers were very much hated by Marx and Marxism. That is a different tradition. That's the sort of soft left, social democratic, more left liberal tradition. That's the tradition I think that is most important when it comes to explaining the rise of woke, that what it is a kind of radicalization of that public morality, which in some ways has a root in Christianity, what Nietzsche would call the slave morality, the focus on the weak and the defense of the weak in Christianity, which informs humanitarianism, which informs social democracy, and that whole left liberal tradition. I would say that's closer to the rise of woke than cultural Marxism. Now, cultural Marxism contributes elements, but I think if you were to explain support for defund the police, the excesses of defund the police, this is coming more from people who think the police are being nasty to a weak group who we have to protect. That sort of humanitarian impulse, I think, is the driving force, not people saying, the police are upholding a systemic structure of a structure of systemic racism, which you can't see, but is systemically leading to inequality. That very intellectual argument from cultural Marxism, I don't think is the driving force for why we saw phenomena such as Black Lives Matter succeed to the extent it did. Yes, it's important for some intellectuals, but I don't think, if we really are trying to explain the guts of cancel culture, I trace it much more to this humanitarian extremism rather than cultural Marxism.
It's like this idea of, you start with an idea of, I want to defend someone who's marginalized, somehow struggling, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay, well, the first thing I'm going to do is not attack them. It's like, well, through some indirect means, they might be being attacked by prevented from accessing hormones or something like that. Okay, now I have to jump in and be the protector role, and part of that protector involves seizing power so that I can protect someone. It's like in my mind, this is like a defensive maneuver, me seizing power.
Yeah. In your mind, but for the other people around you, when you're seizing power, it doesn't look like you're a liberator. It looks like you're yet another authority. I mean, it's fascinating. If you look at the history of a lot of different revolutions, they seem to start off as, with this sort of idealistic um, movement that wants to topple authority, and then almost immediately once they get in power, I mean, look what happens. I mean, study Stalinism,
Yeah.
Maoism, study any communist revolution. They always start off with what sound like beautiful ideas. They topple one authority and they reinstitute another authority that ends up being probably more despotic than the one that was replaced, arguably.
That's kind of the bizarre thing about America is as being founded, the founders like, how can we give ourselves the least amount of authority?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think you're right. Another way to think about this might be to contrast, for example, the Weather Underground, the sharp end of neo-Marxist radicalism, which isn't particularly concerned with the hurt feelings of groups, to the more hippie tendency, which is this peace love kind of very much, oh, we're soft and we're concerned about people, people who've got the short end of the stick and we feel bad about them and how they're being treated. So I would say it's that second element, which is much more important if we're to explain the success of wokery. It has to resonate. Why didn't the liberal academics resist the appointment of radicals, resist the chucking out of the Western canon in Stanford in the late 1980s and 90s, resist speech codes and cancel culture? Well, it's partly because they thought the radicals had a point and that their heart was in the right place. And so they were partly sympathetic to mandatory diversity statements. They understood the case for that. It's only when you ask certain questions, but, which is more important, for example, academic freedom versus social justice, which should be prioritized in a university. Then the liberals will come out in favor of academic freedom. So if you phrase questions in certain ways, what you notice is that the liberals also care about freedom. They don't just care about social justice, but they care a lot about that so-called social justice stuff too. It's just that the Marxists don't care at all about the freedom stuff. So I think you're kind of getting this tension within, and that's what I kind of try and stress in the book, is the left liberals really are part, they very much do believe in these values too, even if they also believe in the Enlightenment stuff. Sometimes the Enlightenment stuff takes precedence, but in other times, the Enlightenment stuff, they might look the other way. So that's kind of, I think that is an important group, and it's sort of not talked about enough when we analyze the phenomenon of woke.
That's the entire critical theory method, is to bitch and complain unfairly about everything, to untether people from their roots so you can redefine who they are in a way that they are dependent on you to tell them who they are from moment to moment in the future. The pinnacle expression of this is trans, where you come in and you tell a child, no, you can't use, your basic eyes and ears and senses to determine when a boy is a boy and a girl is a girl. It's way more complicated than that. It's secret. It's inside people's head. We have all these complicated things you are not possibly going to be able to understand, so you never have concrete category formation, and you're always going to depend on us, like Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson said in her confirmation hearing, that she herself can't answer the simple question of what is a woman while she is a woman. She doesn't know what a woman is without deferring to some kind of expert. That's what the critical method's all about. It's always about cutting you from your roots so you don't know who you are, so they can redefine who you are and make you dependent on them as the definition givers for your world. And like I said, this is the Soros method. This is everywhere the dialectic exists. This is the method.
I mean, if you take the letters DEI, diversity and equity is about equal outcomes and affirmative action. Inclusion, that word inclusion, is basically about saying you cannot offend even the most hypersensitive member of a historically marginalized group because they're so traumatized that anything that even has the remotest hint of an echo of something from the past will be so incredibly traumatizing. Even a statue will be incredibly traumatizing because it'll remind them of this historic oppression. It's this very, therapeutic, infantilizing view of members of groups. So I guess I think that whole therapeutic strain, which of course does link back to the humanitarians, we're going to be super nice to people and we need to treat people who've been oppressed in a very fragile way. I think that comes out of ultimately a humanitarian inheritance, which leads back to Christianity and Christian socialism, not Marxism. So I guess I'm tracing this therapeutic thing back through humanitarianism and not through the Marxist tradition.
I feel like a lot of times they would respond, well, we don't have to be as worried about bullying or violence towards men, white people, whoever the oppressor group is. And sometimes it's almost celebrated because you're like decentering the power structures or something like that, where like there's, they don't often say it out loud, but once you dig into it, it's very explicit that you don't treat everybody equally.
Right. And that's why Marx was very much against human rights. The Marxist tradition is not a human rights tradition. They don't believe in human rights. Marx thought human rights was just bourgeois, liberal Christian Protestant inheritances. So I think the best way to respond to that is say, do you believe in human rights or not? If someone says yes, they'll probably challenge their belief there. But the other thing is, what I like to say when people say that is, look, you're against stereotyping, right? Why are you stereotyping people as oppressors or oppressed based on the fact that they're part of a group that has 3.5 billion people or 1 billion people or whatever? There's more variation within the group than between the groups often and most of the time. So if you treat people as individuals and you start with a human rights lens, you'll never go towards wokeism. So I think many people have that evolution over time when they see the cruelty, the callousness, the racism, the stereotyping, the lack of forgiveness. They see it as a very mean religion that they don't want to be a part of.
That's the entirety of the entirety of critical theory is built around identity, but it's not built around your identity. It's built around you fitting into the box of a pre-programmed identity, because that makes it easier, but it's not you, right? You're not just your skin color. You're not just your religious beliefs. You're not just your nationality. You are the amalgamation of all of your lived experience plus those things, right? And the major mistake of critical theory is that it eschews the personal for the purely tribal.
If I'm not mistaken, I think that concept goes back to Karl Marx, because Karl Marx had this idea that the petty bourgeoisie, which was kind of the middle class or the small like manufacturers or craftsmen, were standing in the way of the revolution. And that's kind of how Zen portrays the middle class.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. He's a Marxist. I mean, A People's History of the United States is a Marxist history. It's updated. He uses the lingo of the 1960s, even though it was published in 1980. But he was clever enough to avoid the the verbiage, the diction of the dreadfully boring Marxist writing, and update it. The system. It's the system, man. That still resonated in the 1980s. I mean, that's 1980s when Ronald Reagan was elected, and so the protesting class of the 1960s were kind of adrift. And so, but he, tapped into the feelings of that generation and their children. And it still seems to be fresh to a lot of young people. I mean, so now it's 45 years after it was first published, and it's still one of the best-selling books out there.
You evaluate this in historical terms. I don't know what to compare it to. I mean, there's little segments of it. I know Michael Schellenberger compared a lot of the gender medicine to lobotomies, but how do you view wokeness in big historical terms? How will history view this moment and this movement?
Well, I even discussed a little bit of that when I was on the public podcast back just over a year ago, I believe now. And I think you have to go back to some of the stuff in Germany and Europe during the sort of, interlude between World War I, World War II. But as far as how this particular period of time will be characterized, it's going to be difficult to say because social media wasn't around back then. Even though you had ways of amplifying messages, social media has just completely taken the lid off communication in a way that has been unprecedented even prior to, even when you had television. I mean, it's just insane now where people can get their information. So I think historically looking back, where we place the current situation and current phenomenon in the last, say, 2016 to 2024 is going to be determined about what we get going forward. I mean, do we get back to a period of grounding, or do we lose and does things just go off the rails even further? You know, hopefully that's changed, but you just don't know how we're going to be able to relatively situate this period of woke insanity. Is it a prelude? Or is it a sort of an end to something?
You know, a lot of what passes as woke, and I guess I would say this too about deconstruction, is it does seem to me like a very adolescent psychology. It's simplistic in its thinking in the way young people can be. You can't really sense any of the subtlety of thought, the maturity of experience in any of its ideas. It's simplistic. You know, if you're a member of a certain class or a certain type of person, then certain things are true about you. That's not the thinking of a well-developed, mature human being. It's just, it's not. The idea that, oh, if I just educate people about, you know, certain beliefs, they're going to be okay. That's a very, I hate to keep using that word adolescent in a pejorative way, but it's kind of a juvenile form of thinking. A full-grown adult knows better.
You know, I think something you hinted at is that a lot of this, you know, it seems that, first of all, there's just incomprehensible jargon. You hear about the hegemony of hermeneutics and epistemic violence and this language that sounds like nonsense until you translate it.
Yes.
And then there's like this obsession around identity politics. But behind all that, there's always lurking in the shadows this specter of Marxism.
Yes.
You know, this idea that we're going to completely destroy, wipe out civilization, and from the ashes, the phoenix that rises will be this utopian society. You know, so if you got people who are saying that the English countryside is racist, it's I think this is The Guardian who said it's green, unpleasant land.
I happen to live there. Yes.
Yes. And you say, okay, what is going on here? But you know that behind that is like we have to demolish all this so that we can build this kind of communist paradise.
Yeah.
Can you comment on that a little bit?
Yeah, this troubles me. I've just done a talk, Ryan, in a sort of coastal area, sort of North England, where they have an NHS trust who are trying to bring in anti-racism. And the reason they're doing that is that they believe that it's a 94% white population there. And the idea of bringing in anti-racism is to try and educate these people out of their racism, you know? And this is not going to work. I mean, Jordan Peterson speaks very well, doesn't he, about how communism, which is, I suppose, what it is really, Marxism just doesn't work. It causes an enormous amount of pain. And, you know, we've seen what's happened with Mao, you know, never ever has it worked. And yet there seem to be a group of people who believe, oh, well, it's because they didn't do it properly. You know, we'll do it properly this time. Well, what is that going to look like? And in the meantime, how many people are going to be harmed as a result of that? Things like health equity. I mean, I think it was Carrie Mendoza from FAIR was talking about what had happened during the COVID pandemic, with some states actually describing, you know, or prescribing treatments for underrepresented groups, people with certain skin colour, whereas those who were white but extremely sick had to wait. Is that a society that we're going towards? Because that isn't a society that I want to live in.
You know, the more Marxism moves from theory to practice, the more it starts to look like its opposite. So, you know, the promise is we're going to have a great liberation and free everyone. The practice is the most authoritarian and totalitarian systems the world's ever known.
And Helen and I had already kind of agreed to work together on a book that she wanted to write about postmodernism and its relevance to this radicalism on the left. You know, we're now late 2010s. Still pretty early. Nobody's calling it woke yet. We don't have that terminology. We were looking for the right terminology in a book by Robin DiAngelo. We kind of settled on critical social justice or social justice ideology for the obvious reasons. And so we collaborated coming out of that grievance studies, we collaborated on a book called Cynical Theories that explains the postmodernist elements in all of these different cultural studies developments. And that was, I guess, fairly foreign to a lot of people because it was a very exciting and eye-opening book. I hear it all the time that it's the book that opened their eyes and changed their minds and made them aware of everything going on in the world with the woke. It's sold over 500,000 copies. It's in over 30 languages. It's kind of been a big eye-opener for people all around the world. And I just dedicated my life in the kind of aftermath of these projects and the aftermath of the grievance studies affair to exposing whatever all this is as fast as I can study and learn about it and put together my ideas. So I created a company called New Discourses. It's located at newdiscourses.com. It is an information portal. That's all it is. I am an LLC, so I am actually a for-profit company, and I operate like I'm a 501c3. I don't take any donations. I don't have any funders, but I put out information constantly for free. As fast as I can make it, as fast as I can read it, as fast as I can synthesize it into articles or podcasts or videos or whatever else.
The fourth generation of Marxism is what happens when you apply critical theory and postmodernism to identity politics, and that will be the theme of a number of videos to come.